September 1st, 1943, Marcus Island Airfield, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui pulled himself up into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the fighter that had carried him through 11 aerial victories, each a confirmation of his faith in the aircraft and in the doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval aviation since the war began. The briefing before takeoff had been almost routine, a familiar script spoken with the confidence of men who still believed the skies belonged to them. American carrier aircraft had been spotted approaching from the southeast. The orders were simple: intercept, attack, destroy. It was a familiar rhythm, one that had shaped the Pacific Air War since its opening strike at Pearl Harbor. Japanese fighters met American fighters. Japanese fighters won. The Zero had been unmatched for nearly 2 full years. It had longer range, better climb, tighter turn radius, and unmatched agility. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was nearly unstoppable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Yoshio Fukui did not know, none of the Japanese pilots that morning knew, that the war they were about to fight was not the one they had trained for. The mathematics that had once favored them had been rewritten. The Americans had built a fighter that did not follow the rules. It was heavier than any naval fighter had a right to be, burdened with armor, weighed down by protection, and assigned an engine that seemed excessive for any logical purpose. In theory, such a machine should have been too slow, too unresponsive, too clumsy to win a dogfight against a Zero. In theory, it should have been easy prey. In theory, that aircraft, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, did not play by theory. It played by survival. The Zero had been designed with one core belief: what cannot be hit cannot be killed. Agility was its armor. Lightness was its weapon. Japanese engineers believed that a fighter should strike, dodge, and evade. Weight was the enemy. Armor was wasteful. Self-sealing fuel tanks were unnecessary. Protection was for bombers, not fighters. Aerial warriors did not hide behind steel. The Americans, however, had experienced war differently. They had flown through gunfire, crash-landed, and evaluated wreckage. They had studied why pilots died, and why some survived. They came to believe something unconventional. A fighter should not just avoid death, it should endure it. An aircraft should be built not only to strike, but to be struck and survive. That meant armor plating around the cockpit. That meant self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires. That meant a strong engine with horsepower to spare, so even damaged aircraft could still fly. And that meant redundancy, multiple control lines, multiple systems, so that if one failed, another could take over. The result was the Hellcat, an aircraft that could absorb punishment the Zero could not imagine. A Zero hit in battle rarely survived. Its fuel tanks ignited, its structure tore open, its unprotected pilot died quickly. But a Hellcat could come home with wings full of holes, engine coughing, and fuselage scarred, and still land safely. Pilots reported flying back with hundreds of bullet holes. Some counted more than 200, some exceeded that. The Zero, in contrast, sometimes fell apart after a dozen. Fukui and his comrades did not know this as they soared into the sky that morning, but soon they would. The first engagements revealed something deeply unsettling. They could hit the American fighters, hit them repeatedly. And nothing happened. The enemy kept flying. The enemy kept turning. The enemy fought back. Pilots accustomed to victory suddenly found themselves locked in combat with an aircraft that did not break, did not burn, and most frighteningly, did not die. Mathematics had shifted. Before, a single burst from a Zero could bring down most American fighters. Now, even if every bullet struck, there was no guarantee the Hellcat would fall. The laws that had governed aerial warfare since 1941 had evaporated. The Zero, once feared, was becoming fragile. Its greatest strength, its lightness, was now its downfall. Within 6 months, every Japanese pilot in the Pacific understood the truth. They could hit Hellcats. They could burn through their ammunition. They could empty their gun into them and still lose. Meanwhile, the Hellcat needed only one well-placed burst to destroy a Zero. The American pilots did not need to be more skilled. Their aircraft did the work. Their aircraft forgave mistakes. Their aircraft protected them. A Hellcat pilot who misjudged a turn or took a risky hit still had a chance to survive. A Zero pilot who made the same mistake died. That difference, survival, became decisive. Survivability meant experience. Experience meant improvement. Improvement meant dominance. American pilots did not just live, they came back smarter. They learned from every fight. They refined their tactics. They passed their knowledge to new pilots. Their squadrons grew stronger. Their doctrine evolved. Japanese pilots, however, died. Experienced aces were replaced by inexperienced recruits. Training time shrank. Survivability declined further. The Zero, unchanged, became obsolete. Not because it flew differently, but because the war around it had changed. It was designed for a world where agility ruled, where a few did the killing, and many died gloriously. The Hellcat was built for a world where survival mattered more than elegance. Wars, as the Americans understood, were not won by glorious death. They were won by pilots who survived to fight tomorrow. By 1944, the Hellcat dominated the Pacific. It did not just defeat the Zero, it exposed its philosophy as flawed. The Zero represented glamour, agility, and purity of design. The Hellcat represented resilience, power, and protection. In the end, resilience won. When Yoshio Fukui took off that morning from Marcus Island, he believed, as he always had, that skill and maneuver would win the day. But that day marked the beginning of a new era, one in which victory would belong not to the fighter that avoided danger, but to the one that endured it. And history would prove, again and again, that the aircraft which survives is the aircraft which wins. The fragile dominance, the Zero supremacy from December 1941 through mid-1943 had been built on a design philosophy that prioritized performance over protection. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi had created an aircraft that seemed to defy physics, range exceeding 2,000 miles, maneuverability that allowed it to turn inside any Allied fighter, climb rate that could reach 20,000 feet in 7 minutes. The cost of this performance was invisibility to most pilots until bullets started hitting. The Zero carried no armor plate protecting the pilot, no bulletproof glass shielding the windscreen, no self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without igniting. The aircraft structure used extra super duralumin, an aluminum alloy strong for its weight but catastrophically vulnerable to battle damage. A single .50 caliber bullet through the wing spar could cause structural failure. Incendiary rounds, hitting the fuel tanks, produced fireballs visible from 20 miles away. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's most famous surviving ace with approximately 15 confirmed victories, described the Zero's vulnerability in his memoir. "We flew with death as our constant companion. Every mission, we knew that a single lucky shot from an enemy gunner could set us ablaze. We accepted this. The Zero's performance made us superior warriors. The lack of protection made us fearless. Only later did we understand it simply made us dead." The Imperial Japanese Navy's philosophy held that the best protection was not being hit. Superior maneuverability meant evading enemy fire. Superior pilot skill meant shooting first. Superior tactics meant controlling every engagement. This doctrine had worked brilliantly against the Curtiss P-40 Warhawks in China, the Brewster Buffaloes in Malaya, the Hawker Hurricanes over Ceylon. It failed catastrophically against the Hellcat. The Fortress philosophy. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation approached fighter design from the opposite direction. Chief Engineer William Schwendler and his team designed the F6F with a fundamental assumption that Japanese doctrine rejected. The aircraft would be hit multiple times. In every combat mission, the question wasn't how to avoid damage, but how to survive it and continue fighting. The resulting aircraft carried protection that seemed excessive to observers accustomed to the Zero's minimalism. 212 pounds of armor plate protected the pilot from the front, sides, and rear. The seatback alone was 42 pounds of hardened steel capable of stopping 20mm cannon shells. 110 pounds of armor shielded the oil system, ensuring that even with the cooler shot away, the engine could run long enough to reach friendly territory. The windscreen was bulletproof glass 3/4 of an inch thick, capable of stopping 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks used multiple layers of rubber compounds that would swell when punctured by bullets, closing holes automatically within seconds. The tanks could take dozens of hits and continue functioning. The hydraulic system was duplicated, with backup controls allowing the pilot to lower landing gear and flaps even if the primary system was shot away. The electrical system had redundant generators and batteries. Even the control cables were duplicated in critical areas, with armor protecting the runs through the fuselage. This protection added weight that horrified Japanese designers when they examined captured Hellcats after the war. The armor alone weighed more than an entire Zero's wing structure. Yet, Grumman's engineers understood something fundamental. A pilot who survived combat could fight again tomorrow. A pilot burning in a fragile fighter was lost forever, along with years of irreplaceable training. The first terrible lesson. October 5th, 1943. Wake Island. The engagement that introduced Japanese pilots to the Hellcat's survivability began as a standard interception. 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group climbed to 20,000 feet, positioning themselves above a formation of 12 F6F fighters from USS Essex. Lieutenant Yoshio, leading the Zero formation, held every tactical advantage. Altitude, position, sun at their backs, numerical parity with veteran pilots averaging 400 hours combat time against American pilots, many of whom were on their first or second combat missions. The initial diving attack seemed successful. Shiga's first burst, fired at 300 meters, struck an F6F in the fuselage and left wing. He saw pieces flying off, assumed the kill, and pulled up to engage another target. The Hellcat kept flying. Shiga's wingman, Warrant Officer Hiroshi Okamura, fired at a second F6F at point-blank range less than 100 meters. His 20mm cannon shells exploded visibly against the American fighter's engine cowling. Smoke streamed back. The Hellcat should have been going down. Instead, it rolled level, accelerated away, and climbed back into the fight. We could not understand what we were seeing. Shiga wrote in his combat report. Our hits were solid. We saw debris, saw smoke, saw what should have been fatal damage. The American fighters absorbed it and continued fighting as though nothing had happened. It was like shooting at ghosts. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. The Zeros fired approximately 3,000 rounds of 7.7mm ammunition and 120 rounds of 20mm cannon shells. They achieved hits on 9 of the 12 Hellcats. 2 Hellcats showed visible damage, trailing smoke and flying with reduced performance. Both made it back to their carrier. 8 Zeros were shot down. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, leading the Hellcat formation, returned with his aircraft showing 72 bullet holes, 3 20mm shell impacts that had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat, and a control cable severed by a round that had been stopped by the duplicate cable 6 inches away. His combat report was clinical. Engaged, 12 Zeros at Angels 20. Enemy aircraft demonstrated expected maneuverability and aggression. Own aircraft took multiple hits without significant loss of performance. Armor plate stopped several rounds that would have been fatal. Self-sealing tanks took 4 hits, sealed successfully. Shot down 3 enemy aircraft, probably got 2 more. Aircraft is repairable and will return to service within 48 hours. The damage mathematics. The technical reports from both sides of these early engagements revealed a disparity that would prove decisive. A Zero, hit by a single 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round, had a 67% probability of catastrophic damage. Hit in the fuel tank meant immediate fire. Hit in the wing spar meant structural failure. Hit in the engine meant loss of coolant and seizure within minutes. The lightweight structure that gave the Zero its performance meant there was no redundancy, no margin for damage. Multiple Zeros were lost to what American pilots described as lucky shots, single rounds that happened to hit critical components. Because everything on the Zero was critical, a Hellcat hit by a 20mm cannon shell, the most powerful weapon the Zero carried, had a 12% probability of catastrophic damage if hit in the engine, 3% if hit anywhere else. The armor absorbed or deflected most hits. The redundant systems meant that even significant damage rarely caused immediate loss of the aircraft. The self-sealing tanks meant that fuel hits, the death sentence for a Zero, were survivable. Commander James Flatley, Air Group Commander aboard USS Yorktown, conducted a systematic study of battle damage after the Marcus Island engagement. His report, preserved in the National Archives, documented Hellcats that had survived damage that would have destroyed any previous fighter. One F6F returned with a 20mm shell that had penetrated the engine cowling, destroyed 2 cylinders of the R2800 engine, and exited through the side of the cowl. The engine continued running on the remaining 12 cylinders, producing enough power to maintain formation and land safely aboard the carrier. Another Hellcat took a 20mm hit directly to the oil cooler, the same hit that had killed dozens of Allied fighters earlier in the war. The duplicate oil system maintained pressure long enough for the pilot to fly 180 miles back to the task force. A third F6F was hit by 37 7.7mm rounds and 5 20mm shells. The pilot was unwounded, protected by the armor. The aircraft landed aboard ship, was repaired in 4 days, and returned to combat. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The psychological impact. For Japanese pilots accustomed to seeing enemy aircraft explode or burn when hit, the Hellcat's survivability was psychologically devastating. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai encountered this phenomenon during his first engagement with Hellcats in June 1944 over Iwo Jima. An ace with years of combat experience, Sakai achieved perfect firing position on an F6F, closed to 50 meters, and fired a 3-second burst that he estimated put 40 rounds into the target. "I saw my tracers walking up the fuselage," Sakai recalled. "Pieces flew off the tail. Smoke appeared from the engine. In 2 years of combat, I had never seen an aircraft take such damage and not fall. The Hellcat rolled inverted, dove away, then climbed back up and came at me. I spent the next 5 minutes running for my life." The realization that even perfect gunnery might not result in a kill undermined the confidence that had made Japanese pilots effective. Warrant Officer Kinsuke Muto described the evolution of Japanese tactics in response to Hellcat durability. "In early engagements, we attacked, as we always had, one pass, fire at optimal range, move to next target. When the Americans didn't go down, we made second passes, third passes. We wasted ammunition on aircraft that refused to die while their wingmen shot us down. Eventually, we learned we had to either achieve catastrophic hits, the cockpit or wing route, or disengage. But the Hellcat gave us so few opportunities for such precise shooting." The attrition equation. The strategic impact of the Hellcat's survivability emerged in the attrition statistics. In the 6 months from October 1943 through March 1944, Japanese naval air forces lost approximately 1,200 aircraft in combat with F6F fighters. American losses to Japanese fighters during the same period totaled 68 Hellcats. The kill ratio of 17.6 to 1 wasn't just about superior American tactics or better trained pilots. It was about the mathematical reality that Hellcats returned from combat that would have destroyed their opponents. A Japanese formation that engaged Hellcats might shoot down 1 American aircraft while losing 4 Zeros. But the Hellcat squadron might have 6 additional aircraft that returned to base, damaged, were repaired, and flew again the next day. The Zero squadron had no such reserve. Every damaged Zero was a total loss because damage that was repairable in a Hellcat was catastrophic in a Zero. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, analyzing Japanese combat losses in early 1944, identified the survivability gap as the critical factor. We achieve hits. Our pilots report strikes on enemy aircraft in nearly every engagement. Yet our loss rates continue to climb while American strength grows. The enemy has created an aircraft we cannot kill fast enough to matter. Even when we shoot them down, they often survive to be rescued. Our pilots die in burning aircraft or drown when damaged Zeros fall into the sea. The Mariana's revelation, the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, demonstrated the Hellcat's survivability at operational scale in what American pilots immediately dubbed the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation committed 450 carrier aircraft against Task Force 58's defensive screen of 450 F6F Hellcats. The battle lasted approximately 8 hours. Japanese pilots reported shooting down over 100 American aircraft. Post-battle assessment showed 23 Hellcats lost to all causes, including operational accidents. Conversely, American pilots claimed 412 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Post-battle analysis confirmed 346 Japanese aircraft lost, with the discrepancy due to multiple pilots claiming the same easy kills. The disparity wasn't entirely due to American tactical superiority. It was the simple fact that Hellcats survived damage while Zeros didn't. Lieutenant Zenji Abe led a Zero fighter escort protecting a strike formation in the battle's second wave. His after-action report described hitting multiple Hellcats without results. I fired on 6 American fighters, saw strikes on 4 of them. None fell. Meanwhile, my formation of 18 fighters was reduced to 3 survivors. Every Zero hit went down. Every Hellcat hit kept fighting. By battle's end, we understood we were not fighting aircraft. We were fighting flying fortresses that happened to be shaped like fighters. Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15 from USS Essex, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft that day, becoming an ace in a single mission. His Hellcat returned with 14 bullet holes, 2 20mm shell impacts that had destroyed his tail wheel and damage to the elevator that required both hands on the stick to maintain control. He landed safely aboard Essex. The aircraft was repaired overnight, and he flew combat again the next morning. How many Japanese pilots could say the same? The rescue factor. The Hellcat's survivability extended beyond its ability to absorb damage and keep flying. It could keep flying long enough to reach friendly territory or at least get close enough for rescue. The combination of armor protecting the pilot and systems allowing damaged aircraft to remain airborne meant that Hellcat pilots who survived being shot down had dramatically higher survival rates than their Japanese counterparts. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrachu, flying from USS Lexington, was hit by anti-aircraft fire during the Mariana's battle. A 5-inch shell fragment tore through his wing, severed a fuel line, and started a fire. In a Zero, this would have been immediately fatal. The self-sealing tank extinguished the fire. The duplicate fuel system maintained flow from the other tank. Vrachu flew 70 miles back toward the task force before his damaged engine quit. He ditched successfully, the armor having protected him from the AA fragments that had filled the cockpit. A destroyer picked him up 4 hours later. He was flying combat again 3 days later. The U.S. Navy's combat search and rescue infrastructure, combined with the Hellcat's ability to keep flying long enough to reach rescue zones, meant that the majority of Hellcat pilots who were shot down survived. Japanese pilots flying aircraft that disintegrated when hit and lacking effective rescue capabilities usually died when their Zero was damaged. This created a compounding advantage. American squadrons maintained veteran pilots who had survived being shot down and returned to combat. Japanese squadrons lost pilots permanently with each engagement, forcing them to replace experienced veterans with inadequately trained replacements. The testimony of survivors. Commander Saburo Sakai, one of the few Japanese aces to survive the war, provided the most detailed analysis of the Hellcat's protective systems from the Japanese perspective. Shot down and nearly killed in August 1942 by American gunners who left him with one eye and a fractured skull, Sakai returned to combat. In June 1944, his first encounter with Hellcats over Iwo Jima demonstrated how completely the air war had changed. I achieved perfect firing position on a Hellcat, Sakai recounted. 50 meters dead astern, full deflection shot. All my experience said this was a kill. I fired a 3-second burst, 48 rounds of 7.7 millimeter and 8 rounds of 20 millimeter. I saw strikes on the tail, fuselage and wing root. In 2 years of combat, I had never seen an aircraft take such hits and survive. The Hellcat rolled away, trailing smoke. I thought he was finished. Then he reversed, climbed, and came at me. His wingman was already firing. I barely escaped. Sakai survived the wars with approximately 15 confirmed victories, though he personally claimed 28. In post-war interviews, he was consistently asked how Japanese pilots dealt with the Hellcat's durability. His answer was always the same. We didn't deal with it. We died learning about it. Those of us who survived did so because we learned to run. The samurai code said, never retreat. The Hellcat taught us that code was a death sentence. Lieutenant Yoshio Fukui, who survived the war with 7 victories, described the evolution of Japanese tactics in response to Hellcat survivability. Early in the war, we attacked aggressively, confident our hits would destroy the enemy. Against Hellcats, aggressive attacks meant we died, while they survived our fire and shot us down. We learned to make one pass and escape, but even this was usually futile. They were faster in a dive, could climb away from us, and worked in coordinated pairs. If we damaged one, his wingman killed us. The only way to survive was to not engage them at all. The production irrelevance, perhaps most devastating to Japanese morale, was the realization that even when they did shoot down Hellcats, it barely mattered. Grumman's Bethpage, New York factory was producing Hellcats at a rate of 60 per day at peak production. 12,275 F6F fighters were built between June 1942 and November 1945. Even if Japanese pilots had achieved parity in combat, which they never did, the sheer production numbers meant the Americans could afford losses that would have been catastrophic for Japan. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded Japanese carrier forces at the Philippine Sea, identified this in his post-battle analysis. Our pilots report shooting down enemy aircraft. I have no doubt some of these claims are valid. But even if we had achieved the victories claimed, 50 American fighters, they would replace them in 3 days. We cannot replace our losses in 3 months. The enemy fights a war of industrial attrition. Every Hellcat we shoot down is replaced by 2 more. Every Zero we lose is irreplaceable. The Hellcat's durability multiplied this production advantage. Because damaged Hellcats could be repaired and returned to service, while damaged Zeros were total losses, the effective production disparity was even greater than the raw numbers suggested. A squadron of 18 Hellcats that took 50% damage in combat might return 12 aircraft to the carrier. 6 would be repaired and flying again within days. The equivalent Zero squadron would have 9 total losses and 9 survivors, period. Over time, this meant American fighter strength grew, while Japanese strength evaporated. The Okinawa culmination. The Battle of Okinawa, from April through June 1945, represented the final demonstration of the Hellcat's survivability advantage. Japanese forces launched nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties, suicide attacks that represented the ultimate admission that conventional attacks against Hellcat-defended fleets were futile. The Hellcat combat air patrols defending the fleet off Okinawa faced the most intensive combat of the Pacific War. Individual pilots flew 3 or 4 missions per day. Aircraft took damage in nearly every engagement. Yet, the squadrons maintained operational strength because the Hellcats kept flying despite accumulating battle damage that would have grounded any other fighter. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading the Flying Circus Division of VF-9, exemplified this durability. Over 3 months of combat, his division shot down 50 Japanese aircraft without losing a single Hellcat. Yet, every aircraft in the division sustained battle damage multiple times. Valencia's personal Hellcat accumulated over 200 bullet holes from various engagements, took 3 20mm cannon hits that were stopped by armor, and had its oil cooler shot away once, requiring an emergency landing on a damaged engine. The aircraft was repaired each time and returned to combat, usually within 48 hours. The Hellcat saved my life at least a dozen times, Valencia stated. Rounds that would have killed me hit armor. Damage that would have destroyed other aircraft was repaired overnight. I flew the same airplane through the entire Okinawa campaign because it was too tough to kill. The Japanese couldn't build aircraft like that. It was one of many reasons we won. The engineering postmortem. After the war, Japanese engineers examined captured Hellcats with the thoroughness of an autopsy. What they found confirmed what their pilots had been reporting. The aircraft was fundamentally different in design philosophy. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, led one examination team. His report, preserved in Japanese Defense Ministry archives, was a technical admission of defeat. The F6F represents a completely different approach to fighter design. Where we saved weight, they added protection. Where we prioritized performance, they prioritized survivability. The result is an aircraft that weighs 8,000 pounds, empty, versus our 4,000 pounds, yet achieves performance nearly equal to the Zero, while being effectively immune to the damage that destroys our fighters. The 212 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot would by itself be considered unacceptable weight in our design philosophy. Yet, this armor meant their pilots survived combat we would consider fatal. The self-sealing fuel tanks add 150 pounds, yet prevent the fires that killed thousands of our pilots. The duplicate control systems add 60 pounds, yet mean battle damage rarely results in loss of control. Every system demonstrates the same philosophy: accept weight penalty for survivability. They built an aircraft that could be damaged and continue fighting. We built an aircraft that had to avoid damage entirely. In extended combat, their philosophy proved superior. The human cost, the ultimate measure of the Hellcat's protective design, was counted in pilots who came home. Of the approximately 5,000 U.S. Navy pilots who flew Hellcats in combat, approximately 4,700 survived the war. A 94% survival rate for pilots flying one of the most dangerous missions in warfare. Of the approximately 18,000 Japanese naval aviators who entered combat from 1941 through 1945, fewer than 300 survived, a 98% fatality rate. The difference wasn't just better tactics or superior training, though both mattered. It was the simple fact that when American pilots were hit, armor and redundancy gave them a chance to survive. When Japanese pilots were hit, they burned. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Bill Hardy, who flew Hellcats from USS Yorktown, described this difference in stark terms. I was shot down on twice. Once over Truk, once near Okinawa. Both times, the armor saved me. Rounds that should have gone through my back hit the seat plate. Both times, I got the damaged Hellcat back, close enough to friendly territory to be rescued. Every Japanese pilot I shot down went straight into the ocean. No parachutes, no survival. Their aircraft just came apart or burned. That's the difference. We built fighters that brought our boys home. They built fighters that were beautiful death traps. The final accounting. When the war ended in August 1945, the F6F Hellcat's combat record stood as testament to the value of survivability in aircraft design. 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, 270 Hellcats lost to enemy fighters, a kill ratio of 19.3 to 1. But the more telling statistics were the survival numbers. Hellcats, the return to base, damaged and were repaired. Approximately 8,200 incidents. Hellcat pilots who survived, being shot down and returned to combat, approximately 340. For Japan, every aircraft damaged was a total loss. Every pilot shot down was permanently gone. The mathematics were brutal and final. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, has summarized the strategic impact in his final wartime report. The F6F Hellcat proved decisive, not because it shot down more enemy aircraft than other fighters, though it did, but because it brought American pilots home alive from combats that would have been fatal in other aircraft. Every pilot who survived to fly again represented thousands of hours of training preserved. Every damaged Hellcat that returned to base represented resources reusable. The Japanese could not afford our losses. We could afford theirs and ours. The Hellcat made that equation possible. The legacy of protection was not a mere footnote in aviation history. It became the foundation upon which the future of aerial warfare was built. The F6F Hellcat did more than win dogfights. It challenged and ultimately transformed the entire philosophy of fighter design. Before its arrival, aviation engineers across the world had wrestled with the dilemma: performance or protection. Most believed that fighter pilots needed speed and agility above all else. Protection, they claimed, was heavy, inefficient, and wasteful. Worse, it was unglamorous. Fighter pilots, traditionally celebrated for daring and risk-taking, were expected to fly machines that danced through danger, not absorbed it. The Hellcat destroyed that illusion. It proved that a fighter aircraft could be fast, lethal, and protected, and that protection mattered more than anyone had dared admit. In the closing years of the Second World War, the United States Navy analyzed thousands of combat reports from Hellcat squadrons over the Pacific. One fact emerged above all others: pilots flying the Hellcat were surviving at unprecedented rates, even when their aircraft sustained catastrophic damage. A Hellcat could lose hydraulic lines, control surfaces, lose cylinders from its engine, have jagged holes torn through its wings, and still bring its pilot home. It could limp back to its carrier with fuel pouring out of punctured tanks, oil spraying onto its cockpit glass, and flaps frozen in place, and yet still land safely. The numbers, when translated into human lives, were staggering. For every pilot shot down flying an unprotected aircraft like the early Japanese Zero, several F6F pilots survived identical encounters. The aircraft that could take 2,000 bullet hits defeated the one that could take merely 24. In war, that difference was not simply mechanical, it was moral. It changed how military planners understood what victory required. The philosophical shift began quietly. Engineers and design boards who had once scoffed at the weight-loving Americans now began reviewing their assumptions. They noticed something profound. Weight spent on protection didn't merely save pilots, it preserved experience, training, and morale. A pilot who returned from a mission could fly again tomorrow. One who died could not. The laws of war rewarded survivability in a way pilots had always understood, but engineers had not. Survival was not inefficiency. It was continuity. It was momentum. It was strength. In warfare, the side that kept its pilots alive longest gained not only tactical advantage, but strategic supremacy. When the war ended, the archives of Hellcat performance were studied by every major aviation power. In the United States, the idea that protection was a luxury died permanently. It became doctrine. It became design. It became identity. The first major jet fighter of the post-war era, the F-86 Sabre, bore the fingerprints of the Hellcat's philosophy. Even though jets were lighter, faster, and more fragile by nature, the Sabre still incorporated armored sections around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant control systems. Engineers had internalized the lesson. An aircraft is a weapon, but its pilot is the weapon's mind. protect the mind, and the weapon remains functional. During the Korean War, pilots on both sides experienced the consequences of this philosophy. American Sabres survived hits that would have sent earlier designs spiraling into fatal dives. Radio communications recorded pilots calmly discussing being hit by multiple rounds and still making it home. The philosophical revolution was complete. The era of light and deadly was over. The era of tough and deadly had begun. By the time the Vietnam War arrived, another generation of aircraft had embraced survivability. The F-4 Phantom, a monument to twin-engine strength and rugged construction, could fly home with one engine destroyed, half its tail shredded, or entire sections of wing missing. Phantom pilots told stories that echoed those from Hellcat squadrons, stories of aircraft that refused to die. Engineers had begun designing aircraft not only to fly, not only to fight, but to fail safely. A fighter was judged not only by how well it performed when perfect, but by how well it survived when broken. The modern F/A-18 Hornet, a direct descendant of naval protection philosophy, fully embodied the Hellcat's legacy. The Hornet was built with layered survivability, armored cockpit tub for the pilot, self-sealing composite fuel tanks, redundant flight controls that could reroute inputs past damaged sections, and engines spaced widely apart to avoid both being destroyed by a single hit. In tests and combat alike, Hornets came back from missions with structural damage, hydraulic failures, and punctures the size of dinner plates, and still landed safely. The philosophy had matured. It was no longer simply about armor, it was about architecture. The entire aircraft was now designed around the principle: protect the pilot, protect the mission. Perhaps the most dramatic transformation came not from the United States, but from Japan. During the war, Japanese aviation culture had been built around a radically different belief system. At the start, the Zero had become a dominant force precisely because it sacrificed everything for maneuverability and range. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no redundancy. The Zero was built on the belief that skill could replace protection and glory could replace survival. And, for a time, this belief seemed to work. The Zero danced across the skies of the Pacific with a grace no Allied aircraft could match. But as soon as aircraft like the Hellcat entered the fight, that advantage died. The Zero could kill, but it could not survive. The Hellcat could kill and survive, and that made all the difference. Japanese pilots were the first to understand the Hellcat's terrifying strength. They described it in fighter pilot diaries and after-action reports with growing dread. When they fired at American fighters, those fighters did not fall. When they hit them, those hits did not matter. When they saw wings shredded and engines smoking, they expected to watch their enemy crash. Instead, they saw him climb, turn, fight, and kill again. For a Zero pilot, this was not simply frustrating. It was psychologically shattering. They were trained to be agile hunters, but now they were hunters trying to bring down something that would not die. One Japanese pilot wrote, "We hit it in the wings. It did not fall. We hit it in the engine. It did not stop. We shot at the cockpit. It did not lose the pilot. We could hurt it, but not kill it." Another pilot said, "Hellcats did not fight better. They endured better." Soon, that endurance became the difference between air superiority and air defeat. After the war, when Japanese aviation engineers studied the Hellcat's recovered wreckage and looked at US design blueprints provided under peace agreements, they were stunned. Many wrote that they had never considered such radical protective engineering to be feasible on a combat aircraft. They had assumed that any such aircraft would be too heavy to fight, but they had been wrong. The Hellcat had proven that protection didn't weaken a fighter, it liberated it. It allowed pilots to fight aggressively, fearlessly, and repeatedly. That was the inheritance the post-war Japanese industries adopted. Survivability became not a foreign idea, but a national necessity. Modern Japanese aircraft designs, like the Mitsubishi F1 and later the F2, were built with protective features that would have been unthinkable just 2 decades before. In time, survivability became a word used not only by engineers but by philosophers, commanders, and tacticians. It was the heart of military endurance. It represented more than engineering. It represented belief, the belief that a war is not simply won by the brilliant, but by the persistent. That victory comes not solely from speed or agility, but from resilience. In the end, it was not the aircraft that danced through bullets that won, but the one that flew through them and kept flying. The Hellcat did not merely defeat the Zero in combat, it defeated an entire ideology. It proved that performance without survivability was a gamble, while survivability with performance was a strategy. It taught the world that the greatest fighter aircraft was not always the fastest, lightest, or most agile, but the one that brought its pilot home over and over again. Wars are not won by warriors who die gloriously today. Wars are won by pilots who survive to fight tomorrow. And that is why the legacy of protection endured. Long after the Hellcats were gone, long after the Zero was silent, and long after the skies themselves had changed. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.